Okay, I bet you've heard this argument before, or even was involved in one. In the left corner, you got your hard-working boomer who never rolled his sleeves down. Sure, life would occasionally give him a curved ball, but he would pull himself up by his bootstraps every time. And here is his point. Poor people are poor because they are lazy. And by giving them free handouts, we only encourage them to be lazier. Welfare programs only breed poverty. So quit whining and get yourself a job, hippie. In the right corner, well, I don't want to resort to stereotypes. So, our opponent is definitely not a gender studies graduate, and her hair is definitely not blue. And here is what her argument sounds like. People do not choose to be crushed by generational poverty, predatory healthcare costs, and system literally designed to funnel wealth upward. A society that can afford billionaires joyriding to Mars can absolutely afford housing, food, healthcare, and dignity for the people whose labor keeps that society alive. Obviously, the disagreement here is mostly philosophical. Are people actually captains of their souls and masters of their fate? Or are we just clogs in a ruthless machine of social oppression? And of course, each point of view has its champions. On the one side, you have a guy with the hair.
Hey, look, you claim to be like me. The difference is I work hard. You've been lazy, you've been nothing but trouble, you're fired.
On the other side, a guy with a beard.
Inequality is incredibly fueled by the notion that there is free will between the lines, that the world is a just place, that people earn, deserve, are entitled to things that they in fact are not.
Which one seems more appealing to you is a matter of personal taste, although in my opinion Professor Sapolsky gets some extra points precisely for his marvelous beard. But in any case, what if we try to base our value system on facts rather than emotions? What does science actually say about the effectiveness of different welfare programs? Well, here at How the World Works channel, we have conducted a deep study of the matter. Of course, it's 2026, so by deep study I mean spending a few hours at Starbucks talking to ChatGPT. Nevertheless, I've gathered a lot of scientific data. Today's video will be a bit difficult to handle, there is a lot to absorb, but it's worth it, because in the end I will present you with some clear and scientifically based answers to the main question: are welfare programs effective, or do they just breed more poverty? So let's dive in. Logically, the first step would be to give you a quick survey of different programs which exist today. And let me tell you, they come in all shapes and flavors. The first category includes programs built around the idea of helping those who help themselves. The best example is the American Earned Income Tax Credit. A low-income person receives additional payments from the government, and those payments gradually shrink as income rises. In other words, if you earn, say, $10,000, the government adds another $4. Increase your income to $16,000, and the government gives you $2. But if you manage to reach, say, $25,000, the government pats you on the shoulder and says, "Good job. From here, you can move forward on your own." The program is appealing because of its ethical message. It encourages a strong work ethic and discourages laziness, because he who earns nothing receives nothing. Oh, and speaking of encouraging the effort, if you like this video so far, would you please hit subscribe button for me? Seriously, for you it's just a flick of a finger, but for me that is an enormous help and a clear sign that I'm doing the right thing here with this channel. My name is Alexei Pashkov, by the way, and I thank you in advance. So, back to our topic. Ironically, the same category also includes China's massive Dibao program. After the death of Mao Zedong, China began shifting its economy onto market rails. With one hand, the state was opening windows of opportunity, allowing people to start companies, barbershops, restaurants, and small businesses. With the other hand, it was dismantling all welfare benefits and social guarantees. That created fear and uncertainty. At the exact same time, very similar processes were unfolding in the collapsing Soviet Union. And in China, they desperately wanted to avoid a repeat of the chaotic Soviet scenario. So, in the early 1990s, the Chinese government proposed a simple idea: guarantee everyone a minimum standard of living. If you earned less than the established threshold, the state would cover the difference. There was, however, an obvious problem with fraud. The temptation to underreport your income was enormous, but officials came up with a solution that proved especially effective in rural areas. Villagers would publicly post the names of welfare recipients in a visible place. In rural communities, everyone knows each other, so if the name of a local rich man appeared on the list, neighbors would immediately report him. The program proved effective because it softened the transition to the new market realities. Its central idea was temporariness. The state would financially support you during a period of instability until you adapted to the new conditions. But what if a person stubbornly refuses to adapt? That was exactly the problem the Mexican leadership confronted in 1990s. Their answer was the PROGRESA program, later renamed PROSPERA. Its design was extraordinarily cynical, and precisely because of that, extraordinarily effective. The problem was framed like this. The country had a huge rural population that is poor and uneducated. But the truly frightening part was that those people were passing their habits on to their children. So the question was not how to improve the current generation, but how to save the next one. And here comes the most cynical part. Bribery on a national scale. Government was literally paying people for socially encouraged behavior. If your child doesn't miss school, you get money. If your child gets vaccinated, you get money, and so on. On the whole, it was not so much a welfare program, but rather a massive investment in the human capital. And it did work, well, kind of. New generation of Mexicans on average was healthier and more educated. The sad part is that none of this translated into an economic breakthrough. Mexico in the early 2000s did not become a rapidly rising economic powerhouse like the East Asian tigers. And since we have already mentioned Asia, let's look at the massive Indian program that guarantees anyone who wants it, primarily rural residents, 100 paid workdays per year. In some ways, it resembles the American New Deal during the Great Depression. But there is one crucial difference. The New Deal was conceived as a temporary emergency measure, whereas the Indian program functions more like an invisible trap for rural population. Yes, people can always get work, but it is hard, low-status labor that provides almost no new skills. They dig ditches, build rural roads, construct dams, and yes, the wages genuinely help them survive, but the program offers almost no real opportunity to climb the social ladder. In essence, it ensnares rather than liberates. But if I personally could choose where to be ensnared, I would pick Indian Village over this place. Before you is Pruitt-Gore in St. Louis, the most notorious example of the so-called projects. The idea of the American projects was to build large amounts of cheap housing for low-income families. Incidentally, many of those families were also recipients of another infamous program, AFDC, which provided direct financial support mostly to single mothers. And man, both programs have failed so bad. For right-wing critics, they're equivalent of a far-right nerd in a classroom full of bullies, because projects have soon turned into gang-riddled ghettos. Criminal situation has deteriorated to such an extent that some of them had to be demolished in 1972. As for recipients of AFDC, critics say that they are literally being discouraged from finding a permanent husband and forming a proper family. Moreover, they are being encouraged to give birth to more children, thus creating generational poverty. So, for a long time, critics could point at those examples and say, see, if you just hand poor people money, they will spend it on drugs and booze, while their children grow up as freeloaders. And that argument worked until 2009. And then the famous GiveDirectly program launched in Kenya, and suddenly a lot of people went quiet. You see, this program operated on an entirely different level. By 2009, even Kenya had been transformed by mobile technology, which made it possible to send money directly to people's phones, taking corruption completely out of the equation. And that is exactly what the charities began doing. They simply transferred substantial sums of money. No conditions, no reporting, no bureaucratic hurdles. The only criterion was whether you were poor enough to qualify. In many cases, it was determined by the condition of your roof. A lucky Kenyan with a metal roof was considered relatively well off. But if your roof was made of straw, you qualified for payments. At the same time, every expense was carefully tracked. The entire program effectively became a massive social experiment. The results were astonishing. It turned out that poor Kenyans were perfectly capable of making good decisions. They spent money on livestock, seeds, home repairs, and medical care. Researchers found almost no increase in spending on alcohol or drugs, while overall well-being, especially among children, improved significantly. However, if you try weaponizing this example against your hard-headed boomer uncle, he will be cornered, yes, but still swinging back, because the program is relatively new. So, what the long-term consequences would be? How will it affect the psychology of children used to depend on handouts? The answer is, we don't know. We are still tracking. So far, I have showered you with examples and case studies which contradict each other. Each program mentioned above was successful in some sense and unsuccessful in other. You probably feel a little disoriented right now, and I guess it's my job to fix you, since I have started this whole conversation. Okay, here we go. Let's first agree on the basics. The success of a program is measured by whether or not its original goals were achieved, and goals might vary. There is a common denominator, of course. Every welfare program aims at providing basic needs to those who do not have them. Children must not starve, period. In that sense, any program that delivers food and medicine to the poor is already a success. However, there's a tricky part: corruption. Here is a simple metaphor. You can pour as much oil as you want into a rotten, rusted-through engine, but it won't do any good. It will just all leak onto the ground. The same is true of humanitarian aid. In a deeply corrupted state, it will never achieve much, because the assistance never actually reaches the people who truly need it. The next level consists of programs like Mexico's PROGRESA, which invests in human capital. And here I have another metaphor, surprisingly, this time from the Bible. Remember the parable of the 3 servants, each of whom received money from their master? 2 invested it and generated profit, while the third simply buried the money in the ground. Well, human capital also has to be invested, otherwise it is useless. If you send a peasant boy to school and teach him how to design aerodynamic cars, you'd better get busy building a factory where he can actually get an engineering job. Otherwise, he will simply return to the farm and apply his knowledge, I don't know, to plows and carts, I guess. In other words, the return on investment in human capital depends entirely on the economic environment. Can the state open windows of opportunity, remove bureaucratic barriers, and create a dynamic economy in which people can actually put their skills to use? Mexico failed to do this. China succeeded. So once again, welfare programs succeed or fail not because people are lazy or diligent, but because in some cases there are social institutions in place which allow people to capitalize on aid received. And in some cases, those institutions are absent. That's the key difference. Which brings us to the last glaring example: Kenyan success of the GiveDirectly program versus the failure of projects in Detroit and Chicago. Why such dramatic difference? Well, 3 reasons actually. The first is the low base effect. For a resident of Kenyan village, a few $1,000s can be life-changing. It can buy livestock, seeds, and jumpstart a small farming business. But for someone living in a large American city, the exact same amount of money creates no upward mobility. Second reason is infrastructural. A Kenyan recipient of financial aid can put it to use here and now. He can fix his house, which means he will less likely die from malaria, or buy a cow at the local market. But imagine you are a single mother living in the projects, and a big governmental check has just arrived. Where are you going to spend that money? Open a local business in your building? That makes little financial sense, no paying customers around. Maybe send your kids to a good school? Well, there are none. In order to physically spend that money, you got to get out of the projects to a better part of the city, which is a tricky task if you look at the map. Projects were physically separated from the more prosperous areas, and if you don't have a car, which you probably don't as a single mother, you are literally trapped. And finally, there is this beaten to death argument: poor people will just spend money on drugs. Well, they probably will if, and that is a big if, they have easy access to drug dealers, which they do in a big city, but in the Kenyan countryside, you had a better chance of encountering a lion at the corner rather than a drug dealer. As for the booze, it was mostly homemade anyway. As you can see, similar programs work different in different environments. And here finally comes that clear scientific-based answer you were promised in the beginning. The financial aid itself is a very small piece of a puzzle. The true job of a government is creating the upward mobility. Let's say I am a lucky recipient of a fat governmental check. If the economy is booming, the taxes are low, the sum is substantial, and the bureaucracy is bearable, then there is a good chance I will do the right thing with that money, open a comic book store, or start a band. Both are great business ideas in my opinion. However, if none of the above checks out, I will squander that money in the nearest cheap water hole, and don't you dare saying that this decision isn't rational, because it absolutely is. Give this video a like if that makes sense for you. Oh, and by the way, there is one more country which tried direct financial aid to the poor and got horrible results out of it. The country's name is Venezuela, and we simply didn't have time to talk about it here. However, we have a special video on the Venezuelan case. Try watching it, chances are you'll enjoy it.